Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The Undead Kingdom had always been a place of shadows and silence. For centuries, the Dark King had ruled over the land, shrouding the undead race in his oppressive, icy grasp. The kingdom's twisted, barren landscapes mirrored the stagnant existence of its inhabitants: liches, skeleton warriors, banshees, and wraiths, all bound to the will of the Dark King. For as long as anyone could remember, power had been absolute, concentrated in the hands of the Lich King and the council of necromancers who served as the king's advisors. The Dark King himself had not been seen in 100 years, yet his presence was everywhere. His most trusted lieutenant, the Lich King, sat on the throne in his place, ensuring that his master's will was carried out to the letter. Few questioned the Lich King's authority. Fewer still dared to imagine a different future, where the undead might govern themselves. For the undead, existence was a monotonous cycle of darkness, death, and servitude. But change was in the air. Whispers had begun to spread throughout the kingdom, a low hum of discontent that slowly grew louder, seeping into the cracks of the old order like a creeping shadow. The younger undead, those who had not lived through the old wars, began to ask questions. Why must they live in fear and darkness? Why should they follow the decrees of a ruler they had never seen, a king whose very existence was now questioned by some? Mortem, a figure once feared as a commander in the undead's endless wars, had emerged as a voice of reason amidst the growing discontent. He was different from the others. He had not been born undead. Once, long ago, Mortem had been a human warrior, a rebel who fought against the Dark King's armies, only to be killed and resurrected as one of them. Unlike most of the undead, he remembered his former life. He remembered freedom. At first, his ideas had been dismissed as radical. But as the kingdom's unrest grew, so too did Mortem's influence. He spoke of change, of a future where the undead could choose their own leaders, where they could determine their own destinies. His message resonated with the younger generations of undead, those who had never known the weight of the Dark King's rule, but only the endless, hollow existence that came after. One night, in the shadow of the Black Spire, Mortem stood before a gathering of supporters. His voice, deep and resonant, carried across the ancient, crumbling courtyard. "We were not always like this," he said, his glowing eyes scanning the crowd. "Once, we were living beings with choices. Even in death, we can choose a different path. We can be more than slaves to a forgotten king. We can rise again, and not through death, but through rebirth. Rebirth through choice." The crowd stirred. His words were dangerous, revolutionary, and yet they struck a chord. The undead had grown weary of their endless servitude, and the idea of electing their own leader, a president, rather than a monarch, began to take root in their decaying minds. Mortem had officially declared his candidacy for the first presidential election in undead history. His opponent, of course, was the Lich King. The Lich King had been quick to respond, launching his own campaign to quash the movement. He painted Mortem as a dangerous idealist, a fool who would bring chaos and destruction to their kingdom. "The undead thrive in darkness," the Lich King proclaimed. "We are bound to the shadows, and through our unity under the Dark King, we have survived for centuries. To reject that is to invite ruin." The kingdom was divided. On one side were the old guard, the ancient undead who remembered the wars and the power they wielded under the Dark King's reign. They feared change and distrusted Mortem's vision. On the other side were the reformists, the young, restless souls who yearned for something different, something more. The election campaign had become a battleground of ideologies. Mortem's rallies were filled with passion, hope, and energy. He spoke of a future where the undead could innovate, where necromancy could be used for creation rather than destruction. He envisioned a world where the undead could exist in harmony with the living, rather than waging endless wars. In contrast, the Lich King's rallies were somber, draped in the cold, unforgiving rhetoric of tradition. His followers, the older undead, stood in silent, stern lines as the Lich King reminded them of their glorious past. "We're the darkness," he would say, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "Without the Dark King, without our strength, we will be nothing. Mortem seeks to lead you into the light, but the light will destroy us." The divide between the two camps widened with each passing day. Tensions flared, and violence began to break out in the streets. Skeleton warriors loyal to the Lich King clashed with Mortem's reformist supporters. Shadows of betrayal hung over the kingdom as both sides prepared for the final days leading up to the election. One night, as Mortem returned to his sanctuary after a rally, he felt the cold touch of danger. His instincts, honed in battle, were still sharp despite his undead nature. He moved through the darkened streets, his glowing eyes scanning the shadows. Suddenly, a bolt of dark energy shot past him, narrowly missing his head. Mortem spun around, his hand crackling with necromantic power, ready to defend himself. From the darkness emerged an assassin, a skeletal figure draped in the black robes of the Lich King's enforcers. The assassin lunged at Mortem, its bony hands reaching for his throat. But Mortem was quicker. With a burst of dark magic, he shattered the assassin into dust. As the remains of the would-be killer scattered in the wind, Mortem knew that the stakes had just been raised. The assassination attempt sent shockwaves through the kingdom. Mortem's supporters were outraged, convinced that the Lich King had orchestrated the attack to silence their leader. Mortem, however, refused to be swayed by fear. He stood before his followers the next day, his voice strong and unwavering. "They tried to silence me," he said, "but they will not stop us. We will rise, and we will win." Meanwhile, the Lich King publicly denied any involvement in the attack, accusing Mortem of staging the event to gain sympathy. "He is a master manipulator," the Lich King told his followers. "He will do anything to seize power, even if it means deceiving you." The kingdom teetered on the brink of civil war. Both sides prepared for the final battle. Not one fought with swords and magic, but with words and votes. As election day approached, the tension in the air was palpable. The undead gathered in ancient voting grounds, their minds heavy with the weight of their decision. Mortem stood before his supporters on the eve of the election, his face pale and gaunt, yet his spirit unbroken. "Tomorrow, we choose our future," he said. "Tomorrow, we decide whether we remain in the shadows, or whether we rise into something greater. I have fought in wars, I have seen death, but I have also seen hope. And tomorrow, I believe we will see hope rise again." The Lich King, in his dark, crumbling throne room, prepared for what he believed would be the end of Mortem's rebellion. "They will come to their senses," he muttered to himself. "They always do. The undead cannot survive in the light. They will choose darkness, as they always have." But as the votes were cast, it became clear that the undead were ready for something different. The tallying of the votes took days, and rumors of voter intimidation and dark magic manipulation began to spread. Both sides accused the other of corruption, but in the end, the results were undeniable. By a narrow margin, Mortem was declared the winner. When the news broke, the kingdom erupted in a mix of celebration and fury. Mortem's supporters rejoiced, seeing the victory as the dawn of a new era for the undead. But the Lich King's loyalists refused to accept the result. They gathered their forces, preparing for a violent coup to restore the old order. Mortem, however, knew that more bloodshed would only tear the kingdom apart. In a surprising move, he reached out to the Lich King, offering him a chance for peace. "Accept the result," Mortem said, standing before the Lich King in the throne room where so many decisions had been made in darkness. "The people have spoken. But you don't have to disappear into the shadows. You can remain, as an elder, as an advisor to the new government. You can still be a part of this future." The Lich King, his once fearsome eyes now dim, stared at Mortem in silence. He knew he had lost. And though his pride urged him to strike down this upstart reformist, he also knew that continuing the fight would destroy everything he had built. "Very well," the Lich King said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I will accept this rebirth." With that, The kingdom took its first tentative steps into a new dawn. The shadows of the past still loomed large, and the path ahead was uncertain. But for the first time in centuries, the undead had chosen their own future. Mortem stood on the balcony of the Black Spire, looking out over the kingdom he now led. The sky above was still dark, the land still barren, but somewhere in the distance, he thought he saw the faintest glimmer of light. Mortem stood on the balcony of the Black Spire for what felt like hours, the cold wind tugging at the edges of his tattered cloak. He had expected to feel something more, yet perhaps triumph, perhaps relief, but instead, there was only a deep sense of weariness settling into his bones. The battle had been long, and the cost was high, yet here he was, the first democratically elected leader of the undead, standing where the Lich King once ruled with an iron fist. He glanced down at the courtyard below. His supporters, the reformists, had not left. Even in the chill of the night, they stayed, their faintly glowing eyes watching him with a mixture of hope and expectation. They believed in him, and that belief was a weight far heavier than he had anticipated. The future was uncertain. Though the Lich King had conceded, Mortem knew that many among the old guard would never accept the change. There would be more challenges to come and more threats, more attempts to undo what had been achieved. But for now, he had to focus on what was immediately before him, the rebuilding of a kingdom that had long been frozen in time. With a final glance at the horizon, Mortem turned and descended the stone steps back into the inner chambers of the spire. The halls were quiet, the torches flickering with the dim blue flames that had always marked this place. As he walked, his thoughts drifted back to the Dark King, the unseen ruler who had not been present during the election or the battles that followed. Some said the Dark King had disappeared centuries ago, a specter whose name was now only used to inspire fear and obedience. But Mortem couldn't shake the feeling that the Dark King still watched, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reassert his power. Mortem pushed the thought aside as he entered the council room, where his closest advisors and allies had gathered. The room was filled with a sense of anticipation, the air heavy with the quiet murmurs of those who had fought alongside him during the campaign. Among them was Karin, a former necromancer who had defected to Mortem's cause early on, and Lyra, a banshee who had become one of his most vocal supporters in the movement for reform. "They've accepted it," Karin said as soon as Mortem entered the room. "The old guard is restless, but they know they can't openly defy you now, not after the Lich King stepped down." Mortem nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. "For now, maybe. But we need to stay vigilant. They'll try something sooner or later." Lyra's hollow voice echoed through the chamber. "Let them try. The people are with you. They want change, and they'll fight for it if they have to." Mortem appreciated her confidence, but he knew it wouldn't be so simple. The old guard had centuries of control over the undead kingdom, and undoing that grip wouldn't happen overnight. There were still factions within the undead who clung to the past, who believed that the kingdom's strength lay in its unity under the Dark King's rule. Mortem was offering them something unfamiliar, something that frightened them of freedom. "What's our next move?" Lyra asked. Mortem ran a hand over his face, feeling the cold, rough texture of his skin. "We need to stabilize the kingdom first. We need to ensure that the election results are respected, that the reforms we promised are implemented. The undead are looking to us now to lead them into this new era. We can't afford any missteps." Karin stepped forward, his eyes glowing faintly under his hood. "The old necromancers are still holding on to key parts of the kingdom. They control the rituals, the dark magic that sustains the borders. We need to bring them in line or replace them with those loyal to the new order." Mortem considered this. The necromancers had been the backbone of the Lich King's power, their mastery of dark magic essential to maintaining the kingdom's defenses. But many of them had sided with the old guard, resisting Mortem's vision of change. He would need to find a way to bring them into the fold or risk having them undermine everything he'd worked for. "I'll send word to the necromancer councils," Mortem said. "Invite them here. If they refuse, We'll find others to take their place. But we need to show them that we're not here to tear everything down. We're here to build something new." Lyra's eyes flashed. "And if they refuse?" Mortem's gaze hardened. "Then they'll be removed, one way or another." The room fell silent. It was a cold reality, but Mortem knew it had to be done. If the kingdom was to survive this transition, it couldn't afford to be fractured from within. He would give the necromancers a chance to adapt to the new order, but he wouldn't hesitate to act if they resisted. The meeting continued late into the night, with Mortem and his advisors discussing the intricacies of governing a kingdom that had never known democracy. There were laws to be rewritten, alliances to be forged, and most importantly, a balance of power to be established. Mortem understood that for this new system to work, he couldn't simply replace the old monarchy with another form of centralized power. The undead had to believe that their voices mattered, that they were more than pawns in a game played by the powerful. As dawn approached, Mortem finally dismissed the council and retreated to his private chambers. His body, though undead, felt the weight of exhaustion. He hadn't rested in days, and though he no longer needed sleep as the living did, the strain of leadership was beginning to take its toll. He sat at his desk, staring down at the maps and scrolls laid out before him, each one representing a different aspect of the kingdom he now governed. The door to his chamber creaked open, and Lyra stepped inside. "You should take a break," she said, her voice softer now, the edge of battle and strategy gone. "I can't," Mortem replied, not looking up. "There's too much to do. If we don't act quickly, we'll lose everything we've gained." Lyra moved closer, her ethereal form barely making a sound as she approached. "You've done more than anyone ever thought possible. The people believe in you. But if you burn yourself out, it'll all fall apart anyway. You need to rest." Mortem finally looked up at her, seeing the concern in her eyes. "I don't know how to lead this kind of life. I was a soldier, a rebel. I know how to fight, not how to govern." "You're more than that now," Lyra said, her voice firm. "You're a leader, and leaders need to trust the people around them. You don't have to do this alone." For a long moment, Mortem said nothing. He knew she was right, but letting go of control, even just for a moment, felt impossible. The future of the kingdom rested on his shoulders, and he wasn't sure if he was strong enough to carry it. But eventually, he nodded. "I'll rest," he said. "But not for long." Lyra smiled faintly, a rare expression for one who had spent so much of her existence in anger and sorrow. She turned to leave, her form shimmering in the dim light of the chamber. "We'll be here when you wake," she said before disappearing into the shadows. Mortem sat in the silence of his chamber, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He closed his eyes, allowing himself a brief moment of respite. The battle for the undead kingdom wasn't over, far from it. There were still enemies lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike. But for now, Mortem allowed himself to believe, just for a moment, that the worst was behind him. The sound of distant footsteps echoed through the hallways outside his chamber, a reminder that even in the stillness, the kingdom was never truly at peace. There were always forces at play, always someone plotting, waiting for a chance to seize power. Mortem would be ready for them. He had to be. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, barely visible through the darkened clouds that perpetually shrouded the undead kingdom, Mortem allowed himself a single thought. This is just the beginning.